COVID. It wasn't bad at all. Don't worry about it.
We have a real car half here. Don't worry about it.
I've got one, to go with your $11 for the national championships. I have $1 to commemorate the number of bowl games that UCLA canceled.
You lost. Give me a chance, savage.
Newsflash, we have a substitute speaker.
I'll take a little change for my 20, but I'll throw in $7. I know we're over in ACC country, but my Gamecocks had 7 wins, and the last one of them was against a school that you guys might know, UNC. Yeah. Well, I'll take. Oh, yeah.
Okay, thanks. Right, thanks everybody for that. Let's continue on so we can get to Tim. Civic is not going to spare UCLA anymore. I do apologize for the handling of the holidays. Just a reminder that for our upcoming meetings, I'm going to work backward. February 7th, we have a very special speaker. We have our Attorney General of North Carolina, Josh Stein, who I think is going to be an excellent speaker. He spoke this once, I think, a couple of years ago, and he was excellent. Looking backwards, before that, on January 31st, at the end of the month, we have Heather Strickland of the Raleigh Little Theater, which has been an institution in town for a long time. So tell us all about what they do. The week before that is a club assembly, which is very important. We do that at the start of the year so we can all decide how to make the club better, run better, and gather the groups and talk about that. And of course, next week we will not be meeting because of the Martin Luther King Jr. Holiday. Usually in non-COVID times, we've had, and the district has had and sponsored an event where we could serve on Martin Luther King Day. Typically it's been food packing for food distribution, but because of COVID last year and this year, we won't have that. But I do just want to note that all of us in this room are leaders in the community or our businesses. That's why we're all here. And perhaps if we're not engaged in actual physical service next Monday, just take some time to reflect on the lessons left to us by one of our greatest leaders, Martin Luther King. I happened upon, I had not been there before, but just a few days ago, stopped in at the Martin Luther King Memorial Gardens here in Raleigh. And what I didn't know was that it's on the corner of Rock Quarry Road and Martin Luther King Drive. But it's the first public park in the country devoted solely to honor Dr. King. And it was created in 1975, and it's a beautiful space. I'm sure it's nicer to visit in warmer weather when things are blooming. But next Monday at the John Chavez Memorial Park, they'll be presenting from 12 to 3 King Day, a celebration of Dr. King's birthday, if anybody is interested in that. And lastly, with a connection to Rotary, if you just put in Bernice King in particular, but Martin Luther King and Rotary, you'll find a speech that Bernice King gave fairly recently, just I think 2 or 3 years ago, at a Rotary Peace Conference and an Rotary International Peace Conference. And she is the youngest daughter of Martin Luther King and head of the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, which is based in Atlanta. And it's only about a 40-minute talk, but she talks about how the King Center has carried on the work of Dr. King by searching for solutions to poverty, racism, and violence through application of Dr. King's philosophy and principles of nonviolence. And again, I think as all of us leaders can learn a lot from him and his lessons and legacy. So keep that in mind as we go forward next Monday, since we can't actually roll up our sleeves and do something. keep those things in mind, possibly as we go forward. But again, we won't be meeting next Monday, but I have great meetings set up for after that time. In district news, 7710, there is on January 25th, a Amplify Rotary public image virtual meeting that everybody's invited to. If you want to learn how to contribute to the club and get the word out on the club's public image. And then we're going to have our service and membership reports. Nicolette Fulton is not able to be here or on Zoom today. But before we get to that, let me have Bill Rohr come up first and talk about our efforts at Salvation Army. Then Harrison will come up and talk about membership and the service project as well. So Bill.
I just got some, some figures today, a few minutes ago. So, according to Salvation Army, we ranked 233 hours, and we collected $10,716.78. Not like we usually do, but under the COVID circumstances, I can understand. Although I think, and I apologize, I don't have all this stuff in front of me, but it looks like we probably had about 90% coverage. I want to thank everybody who did come out and volunteer again. I think it was very successful under the circumstances. I know I was out there for quite a few hours and I met a lot of new people, which is very encouraging. One thing I did want to mention, that I think everybody in this club, including me, needs to thank these two individuals. There's two individuals in these clubs, Kevin Summers and Bill McLaurin, who actually combined did close to 50 hours. Wow. I asked Bill earlier, I said, so what possession to go out there that often? He said that he really enjoys doing that, and I thought maybe his wife was asking him to get out of the house. I know mine did. Actually, she came out there with me too. So, but thank those two individuals, and thank everybody who participated. If you haven't sent me your hours, please do. I do a little spreadsheet, tuck it away, and pass it on to the future person. So, thanks a lot. Any questions? Thank you.
Bill, thanks very much. And this is particularly important this past year. I think I mentioned at a previous meeting, I spoke to one of the Salvation Army fellows who organizes all this. And he said, like a lot of businesses, they hire people typically every year to ring bells in addition to volunteers. And he said, we just can't hire anybody this year. It's obviously a condition around the country. And they were especially depending on clubs and people like us to try and make up the difference. So I think it was a big help. And in particular, it takes a lot of time not ringing bells, but herding cats to get this done. From Linda to Val was setting up Signature Genius and overseeing that, to Nicolette as service chair overseeing it, and particularly to stepping up once again, year after year, and this year, we couldn't do it without. I hope he'll be doing it next year when I'm president too, to Bill. Let's get the hand to Bill. Harrison, you're on now. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for everybody being here in person on Zoom. Welcome. Thanks for the energy in the room today, especially with what we saw last week with the crazy weather, 70 degrees one day, windy like a hurricane, and snowing the next. It was absolutely crazy. So thank you guys for being here and providing the energy. To Tim, Lee, Dave, and all the other guests, thank you guys for coming here. Hope you feel welcome, and I hope you have the opportunity to become future Rotarians. So a couple different updates for membership today. The first is our e-membership deadline. If you remember back, e-membership deadline was application-wise was due on November 30th, but we've had a request to extend that. So we have opened back up our e-membership application process. So if you are someone for health reasons or one reason or another that e-membership might be something that is beneficial to you in this time. We are accepting those applications, but we do have to have those in by January 15th. So please get those in to me and Linda so we can have those presented to the board for approval. Next thing we got is, just want to make sure, yes, is our social. So our 5th meeting, you guys know that our 5th meetings usually are social. This January's meeting is going to be on Thursday, January 27th at 5:30 to 7:30 over at Compass Rose Brewery. We've got the address not up there. I'm sorry, I will provide the address, but you can also Google search Compass Rose Brewery because Google knows everything. But we have the opportunity to actually make this meeting, our 5th meeting, a service social. I know we've done this in the past. We're going to be doing another service social. And for new members, our visitors, the one thing I absolutely love about Rotary is that how it challenges us to live a life of service above self. This club specifically does such a good job of finding new and creative ways of trying to reach our community and better it through different activities and things like that. So what a better way than to have a drink and provide support to our community. This is actually a partnership with the Parkside Avenue Club. They are doing a snack drive to gather snacks for some Southwest Raleigh schools who provide these snacks to children who are low income. They're not getting lunches or are able to bring food to school themselves. It pains me to know, and another thing what I love about Rotary is it makes you aware of the need in our community. It pains me to know that there are children that are going to school today that the first time they'll eat, maybe the only time they'll eat, is when they get to school. I've got a daughter, she's 19 months old. I would move heaven and earth for her. And it just encourages me to know that I'm a Rotarian and I have the ability to do something about it to help those other members in our community that are in such need. So I'm not using that as a ploy to pull on your heartstrings. I'm just using it as a way to encourage you guys, let's live a life of service above self. Come out to Compass Rose Brewery, provide some snacks. We'll have this, I believe it's got up here, but any kind of box like granola bars, squeeze containers of those little apple juices that you're able to squeeze or apple sauces. Those are things that they're looking for. If you want to, if you're not able to meet it to the service station, also just bring it to one of the meetings on Monday. We'll take it there. So put that on your radar, and I hope to see you on the 27th. Thanks.
Bryant, Linda's Bryant on the Zoom call today. He was going to give us a quick report on RILA.
Hey, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Hey, Bryant. You have anything to say about RILA today?
Yeah, absolutely. Just wanted to do a quick reminder, let everyone know we still have a few days to receive applications for the RILA conference. It's for high school juniors. We've received a couple applications from the Southeast Raleigh Club and then one from one of the students who actually performed at our holiday luncheon, which is really exciting. So if you have any questions, just let me know. I can get you the application, but those are due on the 15th. So we have just a few days to go on those. So that's all I had on that. Look forward to the speech from Mr. Peeler. As a former AgriMech editor, I actually have an article I wrote and got to interview Tim. So really looking forward to the speech this afternoon. Go Pack.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Who gets married in early January? No one, no anniversaries report. But we do have a couple birthdays, G. Boyles and Harden Holmes. If you're on Zoom, happy birthday. Next, without further ado, so we give them plenty of time with some time for questions at the end. I'll bring up Charlie to introduce today's speaker. Charlie.
Thank you, President Thomas. Thank you so much. Happy New Year, everybody. Happy New Year. Pretty good. I met our speaker Tim and our Methodist men supper meeting by my friend Lee Clobber. So thank you, Lee, for introducing. And I won Tim's book because I answered a trivia question at the meeting. I won't tell you what it was until after. But He's a good guy, and y'all have read about him. He's a sports writer and written for ESPN, Sports Illustrated, New York Times called him the NC State history of, knows more about NC State than anybody else in America, probably. So I'm appreciative. And on a personal note, when he's spent the last 2 weeks out west, as y'all know, the NC State had a bowl game schedule, got canceled. So Tim went out there with his wife and two sons, and Saturday about 11:45 a.m. I hadn't heard much from him, so I called him. Did you come to Stick Bunny? He said, yeah, I'm in Las Vegas, Nevada, but I am coming. So through various flight cancellations, and he took the time to come down here today. So please welcome Tim Peeler.
This has all been a pretty big buildup. I'm not sure I'm gonna live up to the expectations that have been placed on me here, but I do appreciate you all inviting me here to talk about something that I'm very passionate about, ACC basketball. Not just NC State basketball. I grew up in North Carolina, from the westernmost part of the state, just below Hickory, if you know I-40. I grew up watching the old C.D. Chesley productions. The game of the week went from Saturday when David Thompson was playing to Wednesday night and Saturday when NC State won its second national championship in 1983. So I graduated from NC State in 1983. I'm sorry, I arrived at NC State in 1983. I graduated in 1987. I got there the following semester after the 83 championship. So 1 year too late. I'll never really forgive my parents for that. It was a time of great passion throughout the league, because Jim Valano was at NC State, Mike Krzyzewski was at Duke, Dean Smith was at North Carolina, Lefty Drizel was at Maryland, Terry Howland was at Virginia. So many things were happening around the league, and it was easy to gravitate to it. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I've learned about basketball in Raleigh in the years since I covered basketball for newspapers across the state, and things that I didn't know and had no idea about. And from what I gathered, not a lot of people knew about. Raleigh was a center of basketball, college basketball in the 1930s. Did you know that? When the Southern Conference broke up in 1933, 7 members of the Southern Conference broke off to form the Southeastern Conference. It had already had a long history of having a tournament in Atlanta. Well, when the Southeastern Conference, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Vanderbilt, Tennessee, the big power schools of that conference broke off, they said, we're going to keep our tournament in Atlanta. You guys do whatever you want to do. Well, there was no place that the Southern Conference, which included Duke and North Carolina and NC State, Wake Forest didn't join until a little later. They went looking for a place to have a tournament. It so happens that the athletics director at NC State was part of the North Carolina JCs, who had just built a new, gleaming at the time, auditorium in downtown Raleigh. It's right at the end of the road here, Fayetteville Street. It was built with a unique feature in that it had a flat surface instead of a sloped surface for seats. They made it just big enough to have a full-size basketball court in the auditorium. So Memorial College, or Memorial Auditorium in downtown Raleigh, became the host of the Southern Conference Basketball Championship. Now, they knew basketball would go over well in Raleigh because in 1919, just after World War I and just after the end of the Spanish flu pandemic, both NC State and North Carolina claimed to be the state champions of North Carolina. At the time, you got the claim being a state champion based on who you beat, how big you beat them by, all that. And it was always between the relatively large schools, which was North Carolina, Duke, or Trinity, I'm sorry, Wake Forest, in the town of Wake Forest, Davidson, and NC State. Well, none of the other schools claimed to have a championship, or the championship, but both NC State and North Carolina did. At the time, going back to 1906, NC State and North Carolina refused to play each other in any sport. There's a controversy over eligibility, and the two schools could never come to terms with how they wanted to play and who they wanted to play. I know you'll find it all very unusual and hard to believe that NC State and North Carolina couldn't agree on anything. But that lasted for almost 15 years, until that game in 1919, when they both claimed to be state champions. So at the old Raleigh Auditorium, which burned down in 1930, they held a game, a winner-take-all championship game on March 15th, 1919. And NC State, using a lot of the football players that had gone and lost every football game in 1918, had a terrible, terrible year. They came back and beat North Carolina 39-29 at the old auditorium to claim its first state championship. And that was the beginning of March Madness in North Carolina. From the success of that and having a new auditorium in downtown, they made the bid. The Raleigh JCs decided to run it. They had the tournament in downtown Raleigh for almost 10 years, until a seminal event happened in the history of Raleigh, in the history of North Carolina, in the history of the Southeast, and in the history of college basketball. And that was in a meeting very similar to this, held at the Sir Walter Raleigh Hotel, just across the street, I believe, right? The Raleigh Touchdown Club met for the first time ever on March 15th, 1946. And the topic, believe it or not, was basketball. The president of the Southern Conference was a guy named Gus Tabell, who had been a coach at NC State, one of the two coaches in the history of the Southern Conference to win both a football and basketball championship as a head coach, had become the athletics director at Virginia and the mayor of Charlottesville and the president of the Southern Conference. He invited an old friend of his to come to speak to the Touchdown Club. That guy's name was Chuck Taylor. If you ever had a pair of Converse All-Stars, his name on the side, that's who Chuck Taylor was. He was the ambassador of the worldwide, global, universal ambassador of basketball, who went all over the world telling people about how to play the game. He's in the Hall of Fame because he was an ambassador. One thing very few people know and have ever talked about is that the first time Chuck Taylor ever stepped in front of an audience and taught a basketball clinic was in Raleigh, 1925. I believe it was at the grand opening and dedication of NC State's Thompson Gymnasium, its first on-court or on-campus basketball arena. And from that relationship, Chuck Taylor became very involved in North Carolina basketball in the area. He had relatives in Rocky Mount. He had lots of connections to the state. Well, NC State, coming out of the Depression and World War II, had nothing in terms of athletics. They had 3 of its coaches were drafted into World War II with the Army. None of its athletes or none of its students who were enrolled at NC State in the Army training programs could participate in intercollegiate athletics because that was an Army rule. North Carolina and Duke both had Navy training programs, and the Navy allowed their trainees to participate in intercollegiate athletics. So North Carolina and Duke had really strong, great programs at the time. NC State had nothing because it was mostly using either freshmen players who were too young to be drafted, or students who were, designated 4F and not physically able to go into the military. So they were at a disadvantage. At the time, in 1946, NC State had a part-time basketball coach. He was a full-time employee of the North Carolina Highway Commission, but he coached as a moonlighter for $600 for the year. And the team was not very good. So NC State said, we're going to change everything we want to do with our athletics program. They had hired in 1944, after they lost its football coach, a guy named Beatty Feathers, who was a star, an early star in the NFL and an All-American at Tennessee, first running back to ever gain 1,000 yards in the NFL. he was kind of a superstar. They hired as their baseball coach, a guy named Vic Sorrell, who was from Wake Forest and was a successful pitcher in the major leagues for more than 10 years. And they hired a guy named Willis Casey to be their swimming coach. So at the meeting of the touchdown club, someone from NC State walked over and casually talked to Chuck Taylor and said, we need to hire a basketball coach who's a superstar like the others that were fired. Who should we hire? And Chuck Taylor, without even hesitating, said the best basketball coach in the country is the lieutenant commander in the Navy, and his name is Everett Case. Now, some of you may know a little bit or have heard that name. There's a building on NC State's campus named after Everett Case, but do you know much about him? Anybody? It's amazing to me the blank stares I get sometimes, because there's nobody more important in the history of college basketball in the South, specifically in North Carolina, and certainly in Raleigh, than Everett Case. He was a high school basketball coach in Indiana, won 4 state championships back when they only played single class basketball. That means everybody in the state, 680 some schools, all came to Indianapolis and played for the championship. He won that 4 times. The first time he won it in 1925, there was a guy in the stands who had come from Kansas just to see the tournament, to see what happens, see what it had developed into, what it was like. At the end of the tournament, after he saw Case won, he asked to present the trophy to his team. His name was James Naismith, who was the inventor of basketball. At the time, he was a lecturer and former athletics director and basketball coach at the University of Kansas. He came all the way to Indianapolis to see what basketball had become, and was so impressed with what Everett Case had done. He wanted to make that presentation. It's the only time Naismith ever saw the Indiana high school basketball tournament, the only time he ever presented the trophy. Case brought basketball that he coached in Indiana to the U.S. Navy. Case was not a big follower of the rules. The only person I've ever read about or heard of who illegally recruited players to come and join his Navy team. It takes some gumption to illegally recruit somebody to be in the Navy. In World War II. But he came from an air station in Ottumwa, Iowa, to NC State. He accepted his job without ever stepping foot in Raleigh. They met in Atlanta. And the officials at NC State said, we have an almost completed Coliseum that your team's going to play in. And Case says, okay, I like that. Every place he had ever been before, he had his own new gym to play in. And he said, I want a new gym. He got to Raleigh after accepting the job, even though he didn't sign a contract, and found out that the only thing that was at Reynolds Coliseum was a concrete pad and 7 steel girders. It had been sitting untouched for almost 5 years. And he said, what's the whole deal about this almost completed Coliseum? And they said, well, we kind of need some success for people to be able to want to come to games and want to be here and all that. So we'll get started on that soon. Well, Case was not somebody who was particularly interested in waiting around. He didn't have a whole lot of patience. So he recruited a bunch of guys from his Navy teams. He brought them, and his high school teams, he brought them all here. He only kept one person from the previous year's team. He brought all these recruits from Indiana and made a great team. In the first 6 years that Everett Case was the head coach at NC State, they won 6 Southern Conference championships. In the first 3 years after the ACC was formed in 1953, he won 3 championships. There was 1 year that they lost in the final year of the Southern Conference to Wake Forest by 2 points in a game that's still disputed to this day as to whether Wake Forest actually scored a proper winning goal or not in the final seconds. So 9 out of 10 championships, conference championships, whether it was Southern or ACC, in his first 10 years in coaching at NC State. Nobody's ever equaled that, or even come close to matching that amount of success. Even John Wooden at UCLA lost a couple of those tournaments that he played in. But Mike Krzyzewski, Dean Smith, nobody has ever had that string of success, 9 championships in 10 years in their years coaching in the league. Case was quite he was a character. He never married. He lived in a house in Cameron Village, one of the few residential homes still standing in Cameron Village, right off Daniel Street. He had one of Raleigh's first pools in a backyard. He liked to have coaches and players and referees over to his house after games, before games. Case always was looking for an advantage. He had 2 referees on reserve from New York that he brought down every year to officiate the Dixie Classics. Some of you may remember the Dixie Classic, which was the most sought after ticket in Raleigh for the 11 years that it was contested at Reynolds Coliseum. It brought 4 outside basketball teams to play NC State, Duke, North Carolina, and Wake Forest over the course of 5 days in Reynolds Coliseum. It was a basketball orgy, basically, just being able to play 4 games over that course of that time. And they brought in the best teams in the nation. In 1958, Case brought in Michigan State with Jumpin' Johnny, what's Johnny's last name? Anyway, and Oscar Robertson from Cincinnati. NC State won both those games against those 2 teams and won the Dixie Classic. Big deal at the time. It's the first holiday basketball tournament that the nation really was captivated by. But Case was kind of a heavy drinker guy who socialized with everybody, promoted basketball. He drove around the state of North Carolina, wanted to see how many kids had basketball hoops in their driveways. If he saw a driveway that didn't have a basketball hoop, and he saw kids wandering around with nothing to do, he pulled over. He had a basketball backboard and hoop in the trunk of his big red Cadillac that he drove around, and he would give it to the kids. And he did that a lot of times and actively promoted basketball to the state of North Carolina. How many of you grew up in a house or in a neighborhood that didn't have a basketball court to play? Pretty much everybody had access to that. It became the biggest and most popular thing to do. Case was a full-time promoter of the game. In fact, one year, the Raleigh Chamber of Commerce presented him with the Salesman of the Year for the city of Raleigh because he did nothing to promote basketball and Raleigh and bringing everybody here. Like I said, one of my favorite stories about Case, he was known to drink some early times every now and then with his friends. Dick Herbert, who was the sports editor of the Raleigh News and Observer, was always a constant guest at his house. And one day, Case showed up at practice and he was limping. He was on crutches, obviously had injured himself somehow. And they wanted to know what happened. Well, he had that pool in his backyard, but he often drained it and often did not have water in it. And one day he fell into it and hurt himself pretty badly on his leg. And he saw Dick Herbert in the at practice and said, "Now, Dick, I don't want you writing anything about my injured foot or my injured leg. If somebody finds out I fell, they might think I was drinking." And Dick Herbert said, "Well, Ed, I was at your house. You had been drinking. I saw you fall in the pool." And he said, "I know, and you know, but I don't want people to think I am drinking." So that's who Everett Case was. And the reason he's so important was that he touched the lives of everybody who has been important in the history of North Carolina basketball. He was close friends with Dean Smith, believe it or not. They used to be picked up every now and then by C.A. Dillon he drove them around to various basketball games to scout teams when they could do that, go back and visit each other or watch other teams play. His assistant coach was Vic Boulos, who left NC State in 1960 to become the head coach at Duke. He took Duke to the Final Four on several occasions. He was close friends with a guy named Bowles McKinney, who, if you're a Wake Forest basketball fan, know that he took them to the Final Four and won 3 ACC championships when he was at Wake Forest. The Dixie Classic, the tournament that they played at Reynolds Coliseum, is where Kay Yow used to go as a little girl to learn and watch basketball. she and her sister Debbie and their other sister would go to those games and watch and learn basketball. She is, like Case, one of NC State's 2 members of the National Basketball Hall of Fame. She had a huge impact on the growth of women's college basketball in the state of North Carolina. That directly came from her association with NC State and the Dixie Classic, brought here by Everett Case. Vic Bubas eventually gave way to Mike Krzyzewski, and NC State hired Jim Valvano at the same time that Duke hired Mike Krzyzewski. Jim Valvano's been dead 30 years now, unfortunately. A great loss to the basketball community. Mike Krzyzewski is coaching his last season at Duke right now, 30 years after the death of Jim Valvano, which to me is amazing. Hubert Davis, who's the new coach at North Carolina, this is what's remarkable to me. When they play in February, Hubert Davis will become the 63rd different ACC coach that Mike Krzyzewski will have faced during his 4-year career. Now, this is the question that Charlie won a copy of one of my books on, and I've got a book here that I'll give to the winner of this question. Who owns the best winning percentage record, 10 games or more, against Mike Krzyzewski? What coach owns the best winning percentage against Mike Krzyzewski? No, he never played against him in the ACC.
Representative?
Nope, I actually think he won 3 games in his 10 years of that NC State.
Jimmy V?
He's one of the 4 coaches that had a winning record against Krzyzewski, but he was not he does not hold the best winning percentage.
Didn't Dean Smith have the best winning percentage against just about everybody?
Not Mike Krzyzewski, no. He had a winning percentage,
He had a
but not the
winning
best,
percentage against Krzyzewski.
but not the
Okay,
best.
just want to make that
I
clear.
think. I'll have to double check that. I'm actually, it's very close. But anyway, last guesses?
Gary Williams.
Nope, it's not Lefty. Charlie, you tell him. I'll give you another copy of my book.
Got Carl Tacey.
Carl Tacey, Wake Forest, Carl Tacey. He coached against Krzyzewski the first 5 years he was in the league. And he had a 9-2 record against Krzyzewski, which is pretty amazing. The point I want to make is that Everett Case came to North Carolina to make a basketball dynasty and make the state very important to the game of basketball. Building Reynolds Coliseum was perhaps the most important thing he did. Has anybody been to a game in Reynolds Coliseum, either as a kid or since they've redone it to have one of the best atmospheres in college basketball for women's basketball? That place not only hosted basketball, but it hosted concerts, it hosted speeches. And to go back to Dr. Watkins' invocation and talking about Martin Luther King on July 31st, 1966, Martin Luther King came to Reynolds Coliseum to give a speech at the height of the Voting Rights Act. A whole lot of civil unrest was going on at the time in 1966. He came to Reynolds Coliseum. He drove right down what is now Martin Luther King Boulevard from the place where he was staying. And he saw in downtown Raleigh 10,000 KKK members marching in the streets of Raleigh in a rally that was scheduled to be in downtown Raleigh at the same time he was speaking at Reynolds Coliseum. But Reynolds Coliseum did more to advance desegregation and to end racial disparities within the state of Raleigh, or within the state of North Carolina, just about any place that you could name, because of its open doors policy to have anything and everything in the Coliseum at the time. When you talk about folks like Dean Smith, who was I covered North Carolina for about 8 years for the Durham Herald Sun and the Greensboro News and Record. And when Dean died, he made news because in 2015, when his will was read, he left $200 to every one of his players and said, go have a nice meal on me. And everybody thought that was one of the great classy acts of all time, that a coach would recognize his players. And it was, I mean, no doubt, everybody you heard say that was a great thing. He did that because Everett Case had done the same thing with his players when he died. Everett Case was going to leave his, he had a fairly substantial estate when he died because he owned some restaurants in Indiana. And he left a third of his entire estate to all the players from NC State who graduated and had played for him. There were players, I think there were 63 of them in all. And Dean Smith always pointed to that and said, that's something I would like to do for my players when I die. And he did. And it was a direct tribute to Everett Case. We all know what basketball means in the state of North Carolina. Whether you're a Duke fan or a Carolina fan or a Wake fan or an NC State fan or an Appalachian fan, Elam, whoever. There have been so many people of importance to come from here, but I don't know that people fully recognize the important role Raleigh had in the hosting of the Southern Conference Championships in the 1930s and the importance that Everett Case had. I was just on the phone with somebody as I was driving in here today who wants to do a documentary on the history of the Southern Conference, and one of the full portions of the series is about Everett Case. ESPN is getting ready to do a 6-part documentary on the history of the ACC tournament that I've helped consult with. And one of its entire episodes of that 6-part documentary is the importance of Everett Case. I want people to understand how important he was to developing the game in North Carolina. I'm working on a biography of Everett Case right now. I'm hoping at some point that I'll get that published and I can come talk to you about it again then. He was an interesting person and one of the most important people in the history of the state. I don't think Charlie mentioned it, but I am a member of the board of directors of the North Carolina Sports Hall of Fame, which is located here at the Museum of History. I hope you get a chance to go see that somewhere. Everett Case was in the 2nd class ever inducted into the Sports Hall of Fame. I know I'm running very close to my time, but I wanted to offer the opportunity to ask some questions, or if you have some things you would like to ask.
Let's discuss the demise of the Dixie Classics.
So college basketball in the 1950s and 60s had 2 major scandals, both of which impacted NC State. In 1950, the schools up in New York had some point shaving and gambling allegations. NC State made the Final Four in 1950, even though it wasn't called that at that time. And the 2 teams that, or the team that beat NC State and the team that beat the other opponent at the Final Four, both were caught up in gambling allegations. If you really want to look at it, NC State won the 1950 national championship because it won the consolation game. And the 2 teams that played in the national championship were both implicated in the gambling scandals. That had a part to do with it, but again, in 1960, there were actual point shaving and gambling allegations that were alleged against NC State and North Carolina and about 10 other schools. 4 NC State players were implicated in point shaving and admitted to point shaving. 3 North Carolina players were, both North Carolina and NC State were forced by the university administration consolidated system to de-emphasize basketball. They weren't allowed to play out of the state. They weren't allowed to play non-conference games. They were both reduced to about 12 games per year for about 4 years. And that's the time, not unsurprisingly, that Duke or that Wake Forest went to the Final Four and won 3 ACC championships, and the time Duke won 3 ACC championships and went to the Final Four. All those things are interrelated. And at the time, William Friday was the president of the Consolidated University, an NC State graduate. And he said, basketball's gotten too big. I want basketball to be de-emphasized. And it happened for a while. And that's at the time that North Carolina hired Dean Smith to replace Frank McGuire. Yes, sir.
It's my understanding that Everett Case created the tradition of cutting down the nets. Is that true?
It is. It was an old Indiana high school tradition. And I've been to Frankfurt High School and the Historical Society, where the rims at the old Frankfurt High School, where they used to cut down the nets, are located now. But in 1947, NC State beat Duke. They won the Southern Conference Championship, 1947. The game had gotten so big and important, they moved it to Cameron Indoor Stadium to accommodate more people than were held at the old Raleigh Memorial Auditorium. And after the game, Case sent his players from the locker room out to the court. They had no idea what was going on. He told them what to do. He said, go up there and snip down each strand of the net, and we'll take that home with us. And they did. I've got a picture of the guy who was the MVP of the tournament with the net around his neck. It's the only photographic evidence I've ever seen of them cutting down the net, but it says in the old Indiana high school tradition, the team cut down the nets to celebrate a championship, and it's been done every year since then. When NC State won the 1983 national championship, it's amazing to me. They cut down the net 4 different times. They did it when they beat Carolina at the Royals Coliseum. They did it at the ACC tournament. They did it at the West Region Finals in Ogden, Utah, and then they did it when they won the national championship in Albuquerque.
Touch on real quickly the friendship and animosity with Mike Krzyzewski and Jim Belmont.
So they came in at the exact same time. They were hired within a week of each other. They knew each other very well from their time up in the Northeast. Mike Krzyzewski at Army, Jim Valvano at Iona. Mike Krzyzewski did not like Valvano at all. Did not like it. He, as an Army guy and a Knight protege, he loved everything that had order, people who followed orders, things that were in perfect little rows all the time. He's still the same way. That's who Mike Krzyzewski was as a coach. Who Jim Valvano was as a coach was the most fly by the seat of his pants coach that you can imagine, who played junk defenses, who in Mike Krzyzewski's eyes played a completely undisciplined game, a completely undisciplined program, and was the antithesis of what he wanted his team to be at Duke. So they did not get along very well. Now, at the end of Jim Valvano's life, Mike Krzyzewski often visited him because Krzyzewski's mother was in the hospital at the same time. Valvano was at Duke hospitals, and they repaired their relationship. And nobody has been a bigger supporter of the V Foundation than Mike Krzyzewski. Was on the board of directors for a long time, a founding member of the board of directors. Loved everything about what Jim Valvano did with the illness that he had and turned it into the V Foundation. Yes, ma'am.
Are you familiar with the secret game? My mom always loved that really, and I don't know.
The secret game was a game between North Carolina Central's basketball team in Durham. This was at the tail end of World War II, I believe. And not Duke's varsity basketball team, but the basketball team that represented Duke's medical school that had some varsity players on it. And they played in a game. They weren't allowed to play against each other in a game, in a regular game. But they met at Cameron Indoor Stadium and played a game that has often been referred to as the secret game. And at the time, Central had a coach named John McClendon, who was a protege of James Naismith out of Kansas. And he is the guy who should officially and rightfully be credited with developing the four-corner offense of the play game. Implemented, long before Dean Smith ever coached in North Carolina. And to be 100% correct, Everett Case used to play a full court four corners where he would put somebody in each corner of the court and throw it back and forth. And that is the reason, 100% the reason why the center court line, the 10-second line at mid-court was put into basketball. Was because everybody in Indiana hated Everett Case's stall pipe tactics that he played back then. And that's why there's a center court line.
We have time for one more question. We'll take it from the Zoom. What is your favorite win and favorite player or coach that you have witnessed, either as a journalist or a fan of NC State basketball?
All right, this is a highly personal story, but the game, and everybody in this room probably had, if you're an ACC basketball fan, has a story similar to this. In 1987, I was working for the student newspaper at NC State. I got to go to cover the basketball game, or the ACC tournament in Landover, Maryland. It was a big deal for me to be able to go up there. I covered the first day of the tournament. It was an incredible day with 2 overtime games. I'm sorry, there were 2 overtime games that led to 2 double overtime games in the semifinals. But I was on the court, just going to my seat. There was a message on the scoreboard telling me to call home, which is the only way anybody had to get in touch with me back then. There were no cell phones, no email, no text, no nothing like that. I called home and found out my grandfather had passed away. I got on a flight that came home that next day, and his funeral was at 1 o'clock on, I'm sorry, 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. Well, the ACC championship game, NC State advanced and played North Carolina for the ACC championship. And very guiltily, I drove after the funeral to the graveyard where my grandfather was going to be buried. And I listened to the game as it ended, going to the graveyard. And I felt very bad about it. I knew my mother would be upset if she knew I was getting ready to, or was listening to the game in this somber, terrible moment for our family. And I got there right as Vinny Del Negro made the winning free throws, and got out. We walked to the graveside service. My mom, who was riding in the hearse with her father, came up to me right at the time we were standing by the grave, and she said, "They won it, didn't they?" And she had been listening to the game. All the way to her father. Everybody who grew up in North Carolina has a story like that, and that's the connection that I have to ACC basketball.
Thank you guys. Shane, fine to talk. As a token of our appreciation, a small one, it's like you have a mug.
Awesome, thank you
From
very
the
much.
Rotary Fund, you can make some strong coffee with all the projects you have going forward.
I drink a lot of coffee.
Good. Thank you very much. That was
Thank you so much.
excellent.
Thanks.
All right, everybody, time for the 4-way test, and then we'll adjourn. First, of the things we think, say, and do, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will the goodwill and friendships will be beneficial to all concerned? Meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.